Just a few weeks ago, the San Gabriel was clear, pristine water over white limestone.
Now, it looks like a bomb went off. Trees leveled, soils upturned, and carnage everywhere. In central Texas, water moves fast, and it carries everything with it. On July 5th, 2025, some rivers rose as much as 30 feet or more. Others stayed almost dry. That unevenness tells the story of the hill country and its geography.
When these flood events happen, it gives us a really good opportunity to understand how our land management and development practices affect water.
Not only is weather becoming more severe, our impact as humans has also exacerbated the effects of this weather.
In this video, we're going to talk about how water in the hill country works and how we collectively are making flooding worse.
This video is made possible by our patrons. Their support allows us to continue to share our educational resources, knowledge, and make these videos for you to enjoy. To get access to additional content from our projects, Q&A priority, and more, click the link below.
This river may look calm and peaceful right now, but when it rains heavily, it quickly turns into a raging torrent. Water doesn't stick around here. When it hits the ground, it runs.
The thing about the hill country is that it sits on what is called karst topography. We've got very thin topsoil that sits on top of calcareous, porous rock. And when water is able to sit on this terrain, it's able to soak into the ground over a longer period of time and charge our water table and aquifers. Cracks and holes in this porous material allow water to infiltrate deep into the ground. This water can emerge as full-on springs, such as Barton Springs, but more commonly emerges in the form of seep springs, which can be found almost all over the region. Before human intervention, there were very important ecological systems that slowed this water down and allowed it to better infiltrate it into the ground. But today, with mass development and poor land management, we've removed much of these systems. Now, during heavy rainfall events, when there's nothing to slow or catch this water, it follows the topography of this land extremely quickly. Rivers and creeks, like this one, quickly go from almost ephemeral to biblical levels of flow.
I want to make a really important point and distinction here in that we're not trying to say that we can stop flooding and that we should stop flooding. In fact, I would argue that we should never stop flooding. The hill country as we know it in central Texas are built off of a millennia of flash floods. That's where we get our springs, that's where we get our rivers, and it's what makes the region what it is. The aquifers are a direct descendant of those floods. What we can do, and what the point of this video is to reduce the negatives and increase the positives.
Canyons were carved out by flowing water over a millennia. The springs that many cherish were charged by an abundance of water during these flood years. The aquifers themselves are the bank that collects excess water in wet years and releases them in dry years. So, our goal is instead to reduce the negatives of flooding and increase the positives.
To begin to understand these concepts, we need to understand how our streams and rivers work. And there's a lot more going on than people realize.
This is a snippet of the South Fork of the San Gabriel River. It's a great microcosm of the multiple zones and systems of a healthy and unhealthy river. This zone is the river channel and its flow area. Rivers in Texas fluctuate heavily. In a dry year, they can be barely visible, and in a wet year, they can extend across this entire zone. Outside of some aquatic or wet-footed plants, not much will grow here, and the ground underneath is typically just a mixture of limestone and bedrock. This zone will either gently flow into our next zone or will cut into limestone cliffs, creating limestone shelves. The next important zone is called the Riparian zone. Where the banks gently slope up, the Riparian zone acts as the interface and conduit between the river channel itself and the higher up area of land. Here you will find extreme biodiversity due to the availability of water. In central Texas, sycamores, cypresses, and other trees often help define these zones.
What many don't understand about riparian zones is not only do they have access to water via the river, they themselves actually channel water subterraneanly through their roots, through the rocks, and through the soil that they're catching. This is called hyporheic flow.
Seep springs and small streams will exist at these riparian edges, and water itself can use these plant roots and looser soils to flow adjacent to the river. These zones also trap and catch sediment that is flowing down the river. That sediment then builds soil that further builds out a platform for more biodiversity. Riparian zones are a deep, deep rabbit hole, and I implore people to read more about them, but for the purposes of this film, this high-level explanation should suffice. Above the river valley, uplands dominate much of central Texas, and they generally fall into two types: native grasslands and oak-juniper woodlands.
We're in a grassland pasture right now that's right next to the river, and it's actually in the floodplain. And these pastures like this one that are well managed and well maintained and not overgrazed are super important because all of this grass is sending roots super deep into the ground. And that means when it does flood, not only does it capture that soil coming off the river, it's sending that water deep down into the soil and into the rocks below, not only recharging our aquifers, but also filtering the water coming off of this as it goes into the river and removing the affluent soil and other contaminants that go with it, keeping our rivers clear, healthy, and happy. The other zone, oak-juniper woodlands, also play a massive role during flood events and large rain events. These woodlands are super important during these flash flooding events because these root networks from these trees capture so much more of that rain, just like the grasslands do. With these roots, especially from the juniper and the oak going down into the rock, the water can follow those roots straight down into our springs and even some, in a very small amount, down into the aquifers. Another massive advantage is that because of all these root systems, it's really good at erosion control. So in this instance, what's happened was the river is just over there on the other side of this thicket. It overflowed over that limestone ledge and into this woodland here, right? And when it did that, it brought all the sediment that it was eroding further up the river. And not only did it bring sediment, it also brought a bunch of debris from fallen trees and other things. And so this giant woodland basically acted as a giant net for the sediment and also all that debris. So all of that sediment gets deposited here as soil for the trees and the wildlife and the flora and the fauna to use, but also all of this debris gets caught by these trees. That's debris that's not going down the river, potentially impacting other things, but it's also debris that's getting caught here, and then it's going to be decomposed over a period of time by bacteria, fungi, other things, and that's actually going to further contribute to the soil health, which then feeds back into the water cycle, which means we get more water infiltration, healthier forest, and you can see how this feedback loop starts to, kick off.
These upland ecosystems are crucial for flood management because they set the stage for how water moves downhill. Healthy prairies and woodlands help soak rainfall before it ever reaches rivers and creeks, reducing flash flooding and erosion, charging our aquifers, and giving us more water security through drought.
Now that we understand the flooding, water, and soil systems here in Central Texas, let's dive into the problems that we've created and how we can find and work on solutions to solve them.
So Central Texas has been prone to flooding forever, and it's a product of the landscape that we're in, the soil types that we have, especially west of I-35 in the hill country, but east of I-35 has some flooding issues too. They get a little bit more rain there. But anyway, here in the hill country, we've got soils that do not infiltrate water very quickly, and I've looked at hundreds of different soil reports. This is kind of neat because you can actually see a soil strata here, and this is actually deep for how much soil we usually have. This is probably about 18 inches of soil depth here, but it's sort of thin. It doesn't have very much organic matter in it, and as you can see, there's very sparse covering on top. And so what this means is that when water falls on it, first of all, it doesn't have a lot of plant surface area to fall onto to cushion that impact, and so it falls directly on the bare soil. That'll tend to pull some of the soil up into the water, and then the water cannot infiltrate quickly enough into the soil, so then it starts to move downhill. And then of course we get into the land shape, which is the hill country. We've got a lot of steep slopes here. We've got a lot of rocky ground. So when you combine all of those factors together, and then you add in how freaking hard it rains here when it does rain, and you just have a recipe for incredible amounts of runoff in very short amounts of time. All right, so this is often what we find here in the hill country is one of the more extreme examples. We've got just pure caliche, mostly rock, super steep, and you can see that water just sheets off of this almost like a roof, a very steep roof at that. But you can also see that there's a lot of native plant pioneer species like this twist-leaf yucca here, and a bunch of these little native grasses like curly mesquite and buffalo grass, and some stuff that I can't even ID, but there's little forbs growing here that are gonna help cover this ground and help water infiltrate here and If this ground doesn't get overgrazed and it's given enough time, these plants will take over and they'll start to stabilize this slope and help prevent erosion and help increase infiltration. And of course, we've got the marvelous ash juniper over here. You can see right under that ash juniper, the soil is a little bit brown instead of this white chalky color.
Overgrazing is a word you'll hear us say all the time, and it's a really important thing to understand when we talk about this topic. In this pasture, as you can see, this grass hasn't been grazed in a while, so all of these grasses have super long root systems deep down into the ground. Those roots can run as far as 15 feet. And as I mentioned earlier, as water hits this, whether it's through rain or through the floodplain that we're standing in and flooding, that water, instead of rushing back down and taking all the soil with it that we're standing on that we want, it's being kept here by this grass. And not only is it being kept here, the soil is, the water that comes with it is now being sent down into the ground as opposed to straight back into the river. That's going to manifest in a bunch of ways. It can manifest in streams and creeks, but in this case, it manifests in a bunch of seep springs on the edges of the limestone cliffs about 30 feet in front of us.
Historically, since the arrival of the first Europeans and the widespread adoption of fencing, we have massively overgrazed the hill country. Before fencing and set stock grazing, bison and other ruminants rotationally grazed these regions, never being given the opportunity to overgraze due to external pressures from predators and other forces. As set stock grazing took hold, ruminants ate the grass down to the nubs, and with no chance to regrow, the topsoil underneath washed away during extreme rain events or was baked and blown away during drought.
Overgrazing reduces the ability of the land to in-soak water and also increases erosion. And so as water hits overgrazed soil or overgrazed grasslands, that water immediately rushes off to the nearest point. And when it does that, it takes away valuable topsoil with it. So not only do we not get the value of in-soaking water into our aquifers and year-round springs and creeks, it also takes all of this soil that we have to fight so hard for here in Central Texas with it into the rivers.
So one of the problems that we're facing in Texas and quite honestly nationwide is that we have removed a lot of the permeable spaces in nature like healthy grasslands. Tall grassland prairie systems have the ability to absorb and capture and infiltrate large amounts of water. And that's like a giant sponge. And that water is percolating down into the ground before it makes its way into the limestone karst feature and then popping out into cliff sides like this and making its way into water bodies. So this is the importance of ecological restoration, of preserving habitat, preserving pollinator spaces, rotational grazing systems where we are allowing grass to actually regenerate and have a greater diversity of grasslands as well. And outside of grasslands, it's also important to have dense woodland areas. They both have their place in Central Texas. And those woodlands are also going to slow down water as the canopy is breaking up, dissipating the kinetic energy of the rainfall that's falling. And I mentioned as well, juniper and other trees, including oak, they're breaking through that limestone karst and allowing more water to get in to this, spongy rock structure that then gets saturated and then it seeps out in these, holes and seep springs and comes out of the side of these cliffs and then makes its way into, the water bodies that we have here, rather than just being 100% runoff. So, having a healthy, intact ecosystem is important for the legacy of, human continuity in these areas, for us to be able to enjoy the beauty of water for our own sustenance, for drinking, for recreation, and outside of what we can extract from it just for the benefit of all the other organisms that call this place home.
If you want to learn more about grassland restoration, rotational grazing, and the harmful effects of overgrazing, make sure to go check out the numerous videos we have about these topics in the link right there.
So we're blessed with really clear running rivers and creeks for the most part in the hill country, but you can see that this water is completely brown right now. That's because it's carrying so much sediment with it, because in such a severe runoff event like we had, there's just all of the topsoil that can move with this water is coming downstream very quickly, and it doesn't settle out until the water slows down enough to deposit that sediment, and then at that point it'll start to fill in whatever spot where the water is slowing down. Sometimes that means that it's filling in a deep spot in a river where people like to swim. Maybe it's filling in one of our highland lakes. So it's not always a good thing where the sediment deposits. If we can get it to deposit where we want it to, usually higher up in the landscape where we need the soil, that's better than letting it come down here into the water as technically pollution and just deposit wherever it might. So I did want to mention that, erosion is a natural process and that rivers moving sediment and even changing their course is something that happens, and that's not necessarily a bad thing ecologically, but a lot of the land management practices that we're using these days are increasing erosion, or land management practices that were common in the past have put us in a state of excess erosion where we can't hold our organic matter in our topsoil up on the hills, up in the fields even, where we can grow grass, where we can produce things and continue building soil there, because it's like a feedback loop that if we help it get started, it continues on. But if every time that we get a big rain, we're losing the last 20 years of topsoil buildup, then we're actually have a feedback loop that's going the wrong way, that's causing degradation over time.
The key takeaway here is that when grasslands are continually degraded, they lose their ability to absorb and store water. That leads to more runoff and flash flooding during wet years, and less water held in the soil for use during dry years. It also means more erosion during storms, stripping away the precious topsoil that these ecosystems and our communities depend on. Beyond addressing overgrazing, the next most powerful tool we have is slowing water down. At Symbiosis, we spend a lot of time building berms, swales, terraces, and other earthworks designed to trap water, spread it across the land, and allow it to soak in. Why? Because where prairie, savanna, and woodland once naturally slowed and absorbed rainfall, we now see water rushing off the land unchecked, stripping soil, skipping infiltration, and fueling erosion.
In the absence of those native systems, we can recreate, replicate, or even improve upon the functions that those native systems once provided.
To some, this might sound like a new or novel idea, but it's actually an ancient one, and it's also the reason any of us can even live here today. Enter the dams and lakes of Central Texas. For much of the region's modern history, Central Texas was haunted by deadly floods. That changed with one of the most forward-thinking public infrastructure efforts in U.S. history, the construction of the dams along the major rivers of Central Texas. Beginning in the 1930s and accelerating through the 1940s, Texas built a network of reservoirs like Lake Travis, Buchanan, Stillhouse Hollow, and others with two goals in mind: to control floodwaters and to capture and store excess rain during major storms.
Sound familiar? It's the same principle. Slow the water down and utilize it. It's no different whether that's on thousands and thousands of acres like LCRA and the Highland Lakes, or in your backyard.
So just a few weeks ago, this was just beautiful, pristine, crystal clear, classic Blanco River. Everything's white, you're looking at shelves. And now we can see after all these big floods, we have a lot of sediment that's been moving in the river, a lot that's now sedimented in some of the river. So all of our goal is to capture the sediment, keep it up on the hillside where we can use it to grow food and native pollinators in a rich, complex, biodiverse system. Let the water move through these hills, because you can see it's popping out in these seep springs through these cliff bands. And then the water's still going to get to the river. There's just going to be a 48-hour, 72-hour time delay as it sifts and sieves through the porous limestone, filtering itself and entering the river a couple days, maybe a week later, so that our rivers stay high longer throughout the summers with clean, clear water instead of sedimenting in large deluge flash floods. So we're building on the backs of the giants who constructed the Highlands Lakes projects and saying thank you for making the Central Texas area habitable and beautiful and recreational, and now let's continue to move up higher in the highlands and do these systems to benefit everything that's been done before us. Yeah, so this is the end goal, to have beautiful, perfect, pristine, clear, clean water just erupting out of the rock faces in slow trickle, continuing to keep the rivers full of clean water and healing these riparian zones that need water for rich plant diversity. But it's not just coming in a single deluge, sedimented in flood. It's 100,000 small trickles that are just continuing to support the health of and longevity of our rivers. So the Central Texas watershed is a very dynamic high-speed system. It's steep, it's river cut, so typically the water is going to hit the top of these hilltop knobs. It's going to sheet off perpendicular to contour as fast as it possibly can, get into the rivers, surging the rivers, and then the only tool you have at that point to manage it is large-scale dams like the Highland Lakes project. Massive amount of concrete, sequestering entire valleys full of water. What we're trying to do is add on top of those systems the management of water as high as possible on the hilltop. So putting in these conservation terraces, letting the water sit on contour in shallow, long lakes so that it can seep through these karst features, filling up each and every one of these little porous spaces, increasing the amount of water in our earth bank account so that the earth can not only hold it, but filter it, hold the sediment, and very slowly release it back into the watershed. So we're not stealing the water, we're slowing the water, we're holding the sediment, and we're allowing that water to clean itself and slow release into the watershed over the next week over time. And sometimes the water will hit a various different impermeable layer of limestone, and it'll move horizontally for a mile until it enters another soft porous area which might eventually go into an aquifer. So we're not just holding water on the land where we're doing these systems, it's permeating potentially miles in all directions, horizontally as well as vertically, and cleaning it and holding it so that we slowly release it into the waters better, longer, cleaner, more effectively, so that it's safer over time for all of us for generations.
So right now I'm standing on sort of a distributed spring head, and you can see that there's a flowing creek behind me that's spring fed. But this is something that you don't see very often. It only happens right after a big rain. But essentially water is in-soaking uphill, and then it's hitting a layer of rock or clay, and it's traveling underground, and then it's being forced out right here, and now it's going to contribute to this creek. So when we're talking about infiltrating water, we're just talking about slowing it down and getting it to move through the soil before it pops back out again and then feeds into the creeks and rivers and lakes. Or some of it might find a karst feature and it might make its way down to the aquifer. But a spring is not always a very concentrated point. Oftentimes a spring-fed creek is being fed by a distributed system of springs like this. So here's another distributed spring, but instead of popping out of the soil, it's popping out of different layers of rocks. So there's soil up above, and then there's this line of rocks, and so the water is going down underneath, and then it's hitting, so it's going through this like fractured rock, and then it's hitting a layer of limestone shelf where it takes even longer to soak in, and then it's getting forced out right here and feeding into the creek. So really, like, this is what we want to see, but we want to see it almost year round. I mean, if we can create that. So when 5 inches of rain falls here like it just did 3 days ago, you know, if we could infiltrate all of that as high as possible in the landscape and then have it just slowly seep out like a big water battery and keep these creeks flowing and keep all of the ponds charged instead of rushing out into the rivers, although it would still eventually make it down to the rivers and the lakes that we depend on, it would just do so more slowly and more consistently. And it would do so creating less pollution along the way as well through erosion or agricultural runoff or things like that.
Mike makes a really good point here, and I kind of want to elaborate on that. And that is when people make land management decisions here, they often do this with the idea of how fast can I get my springs back and how can I return spring flow? And I think that approach is not based in the reality of how water works here in the hill country. The goal should not be to create a spring that flows as fast as possible, as soon as possible. The goal should be to have springs and water features that flow, even if it's less than what you envisioned, but flow year-round and provide value throughout the year. That to me, and that to what we look at Symbiosis, is a much stronger and healthier ecosystem than a spring that flows for 1 day and then is gone within 2.
So this is just a really cool example of what we take inspiration from when we see trees that have fallen over into the creek like this, and they're still alive because there's still some roots in the ground. So there's some green photosynthesizing material on here. This is sort of what we model some of our brush dams or beaver dam analogs after. Of course, I would like to make this thicker. This is a good start and it's starting to slow down some leaves and sediment, but I would like to see more material actually down under here. So I do actually think this is a good example of how nature does it, and then a good example of how humans can come in and we can help this become more effective. So we've already got this like back rest here, or this back stop rather, and then we could just add more material in there strategically to help it slow down more sediment and more water. And this is like way up at the top of the watershed too. So every drop that we slow down up here that infiltrates then makes its way very slowly through the rest of the system. Okay, I just wanted to mention real quick that a previous owner of this place, they went to the extent of drilling a well and running power pretty far back here onto the property in order to keep a pond full that doesn't have a good seal on it. So it's basically infiltrating a bunch of water. And so, a lot of people do this, and there's certain groundwater conservation districts that are making rules against it. But I just wanted to say that if you care about the aquifers, this is probably one of the worst things you can do. Honestly, I mean, a lot of that water is going to go back down into the ground, but how much of it makes it back to the aquifer and how long does it take to do so is a big question that I don't think very many people really could even give you a good answer on. And then a lot of it is just evaporating as well, and there's no guarantee that that's going to come back down as rain. So, you're using a finite resource to just create a momentary benefit. So this is an example of sediment that has settled. It washed down off of the hills behind me, and then the water slowed down here and the sediment deposited. And, it just takes a lot of time and the natural processes of soil building for this to get created up on a rocky hillside like this. So it always makes me a little bit sad to see it get washed down. That is why the floodplains are so fertile though. It's because they've been collecting that sediment and that organic matter from the hills for so long. But part of our goal is always just to keep those resources up high in the land while we can, so that those higher parts of our landscape can be more infiltrative of the rain when it comes, and so that we can just slow that down and cycle it through the system. Also, sediment is technically a pollutant when it's in water that we're trying to then use for drinking water, and a lot of times it carries with it agricultural runoff or high nutrient loads, which can cause algae blooms. So I think one of our best things we can do is, as we're managing brush, we can pile it up in locations like this where we know that water flows, or just on contour along hillsides, and this will do a lot to slow down the water. And I have a friend, his name is Brian Hummel, and he was doing this kind of work on a military base, and he said that through doing just distributed nature-based systems like this, beaver dam analogs, brush berms, that they were able to create a situation where they had zero runoff, and all it was just working with the brush to help slow down the water. So this is a really powerful thing that we could do high up in the landscapes, even where we don't have soil, where we've got an overgrowth of juniper and where we need to control brush. We just, instead of burning it, we just put it on contour, and we build these systems where we've got already water channelized. So the flooding and the drought cycles that have been around here in Central Texas for so long, they're not something that we're trying to stop. We're not trying to fight against nature. We're trying to figure out, how do we work with that in the best way possible. And from what we can tell, the best things that we can do are we can try to in-soak as much water as possible when it does rain, when we are in a flood cycle, and we can try to create as much biomass above and below ground as possible, organic matter in the soil. We can build the soil depth and just make this landscape as much of a water or hydrological battery as possible, because we know the floods are going to come, and we know that they're going to be followed by a drought, and then that's going to be followed by another flood. So how do we reduce those extremes? And it's through those three things: just water, soil, biodiversity, and biomass.
There's one more piece to this story, and it's a big one: human development. Over the last century, we've covered more and more of Central Texas with roads, rooftops, parking lots, and compacted land. These impermeable surfaces shed water quickly, meaning with what once soaked into prairies and woodlands now races downhill. This not only worsens flash floods, but also prevents water from infiltrating and recharging our aquifers. Cities grow outwards, often ignoring the topography they're built on, and as a result, the very systems we rely on, our creeks, rivers, and springs, get overwhelmed or dry out faster. We've also built too close to the river. Development in floodplains was once common back when the true scale of flooding wasn't well understood, but today, with weather becoming more extreme and land management often accelerating runoff, flood zones are expanding, and FEMA has had to adjust their maps accordingly. What might look like a safe distance from the river during a dry year could become part of the river during a 20-inch storm.
So we're down here at the Pedernales River where all of these creeks and springs flow into, and we're just a little bit downstream from Reimer's Ranch, if you've ever gone there. And you can just see how much this river ebbs and flows. I mean, it's amazing. The floodplain over there, there's a bank that's like the initial containment of the river, and then there's the expanded floodplain before the hill gets steeper. And this river, the Pedernales, didn't flood nearly as much as the San Gabriel or the Guadalupe, especially in this last round of floods. But you can see that in the past, the water has gotten up to even probably right where we're standing. And you know, we have to expect that. We have to be ready for that, even as we're trying to cushion the impact of that and make sure that we're able to get out of the way of those floods, or you know, not building things in the floodplain, of course, is very important. FEMA has recently adjusted the floodplain maps, so as the weather has become more intense, the downpours more sudden, and as development has increased, as runoff has increased from other forms of land management, even overgrazing contributes to this, clearing trees and burning all that matter, all that organic matter off contributes to this. They've had to expand the floodplain up higher, and it almost looks ridiculous because you'll see, you know, it's many hundreds of feet away from where the river sits, and you look down at the river and it's only, you know, a little tiny stream when you're looking at it most of the time. But you have to remember, when we get 20 inches of rain in 48 hours with almost no warning, that river is going to expand all the way up to the very edge of that floodplain and maybe even beyond it, because FEMA's probably going to have to keep adjusting that as time goes on.
Across the river from me, you can see homes at the top of the banks. And although they look fine now, many of these were partially submerged or flooded during the last big floods. And when homes, infrastructure, and neighborhoods are in the way, floods stop being natural and start becoming disasters.
So this used to make sense. Putting this much resource into building something to help you recreate at the Pedernales River in this location, you used to be able to use it a lot more often than you can these days. And that's partly because the population has grown and we're pumping out of the lakes more, which prevents this section of the Pedernales from backing up and being deeper. But you know, now after this flood, you might be able to use something like this. Obviously this one's in disrepair, but you can just imagine how many people used to enjoy the river and be able to use it for recreation before we started to go into more water scarcity punctuated by little bursts of overabundance.
And this is the irony of all this. We spend so much time talking about water scarcity, water levels, lake levels, and water in general, yet when flash floods come, we are basically blessed with water, and yet we collectively do little to harvest it. Water abundance and water scarcity is something that we can solve in Central Texas. We just need to change the mindset and the culture around the systems and the give and take that that system provides.
All right, hey, thanks guys. Appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, you can hop over to our website. There's tons of good articles. You can join our newsletter. You can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. We'd love to see you there and answer your questions. Thanks again. Enjoy.